Hello and welcome to everybody who is joining our Emergent session today. We called the session Improving Data Synthesis with Open and Reproducible Research Approaches, as we will be talking about the issues regarding systematic reviews and meta-analyses and how they can be improved. And specifically, we are concentrating on non-interventional research, which is very relevant for neuro approaches and neuro methods. Today, we have myself, Marta Topor. I am a PhD student at the University of Surrey, and I am co-leading a project called Non-Interventional Reproducible and Open Systematic Reviews. Sorry, I had to think about that one. NERO, we call it. Together with Jade, who is a research associate at the University of York, and she is co-leading the project with me. And we have two of our collaborators here today, Meghan Testerman, who is a behavioral sciences librarian at Princeton University, and Margriet Groen, who is a senior lecturer at Lancaster University. Meghan specializes in systematic reviews and data synthesis for neuroscience research, and Margriet is starting a new project looking at, I understand, neuro MRI research for systematic reviews. So just wanted to give you a bit of background about NERO, our project. It started because we've noticed that there is a lack of tools for non-interventional systematic reviews, and most of the tools that are created so far are designed for health-related research with the focus on interventions and randomized control trials, etc. So this is where it started, and then we wanted to make sure that we implement as much as possible the approaches for reproducible and open science as well, to make the systematic reviews systematic as much as possible. So I'll just give a quick introduction about systematic reviews and why they are important. Systematic reviews should be seen as a research method. It aims to gather all available evidence on a given topic and synthesize this evidence and look at the results from individual studies and draw conclusions based on the fact based on what we can see from those studies that are pulled together. There is an additional option that can be done with systematic reviews, which is meta-analysis, and this is quantitative analysis of the results that are extracted from the individual studies as well. The number of conducted meta-analyses and systematic reviews rises every year, and the number of studies that are included in those systematic reviews and meta-analyses is also larger every year. So it becomes harder and harder to manage that. It's very important to conduct those studies to make sure that we understand the topic of our research in depth. And systematic reviews not only help us to understand the results of the studies and sort of the direction that the given topic is heading, but also the methodologies that are being used to study it and any gaps for future research that should be addressed. It has been argued that poorly conducted systematic reviews may do more harm than good for the understanding of a given topic. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but we quite like this statement because it makes us feel like our work is important. We just want to highlight that there are many opportunities for bias during the process of systematic reviews, and those may be associated with the researchers' and reviewers' own biases and expectations, as well as the overall literature bias and publication bias, and the individual studies themselves as well. So the quality of and rigor of the studies of each individual study included in the systematic review. But it's important to notice that the mistakes and inconsistencies during the process of conducting a systematic review may not, or most of the time, are not intentional, and they may be due to the fact that there isn't enough guidance on how to do those things rigorously, transparently, and systematically. So therefore, it is important to make sure that there are guidelines and tools for solid systematic reviews that are systematic in capital letters, as I wrote it for myself in the notes. to make sure that we reduce the likelihood of bias. So as I mentioned at the start about Neuro, in this session, we want to address two main gaps. The first one is the fact that there are no tools specific for non-interventional research. So Neuro aims to address that gap. And we would also like to discuss how not having specific tools is problematic for non-interventional research, and how systematic reviews can be improved with appropriate tools for that. And we're also hoping to emphasize the fact that Neuro will be aims or hopes, those are our aims and hopes. No, we are working on making sure that Neuro gives guidance for rigorous and transparent and reproducible and open systematic reviews as well. So we are including pre-registration. We are recommending keeping detailed documentation, sharing this documentation as open access, and we also promote transparency statements for all systematic reviews. So just to make you aware, there are tools that promote pre-registration. There is a platform specifically for systematic reviews where you can do your pre-registrations, and there is different level of recommended transparency and rigor recommended by different tools. But with Neuro, we are hoping to bring everything together and have a stage for pre-registration and then reporting of systematic reviews, specifically for non-interventional research. So I think that this is enough of my introduction. The way that this session will run, we have three topics more or less that we would like to discuss with our guests today. And I will sort of chair this discussion. And at the end, we will take comments and questions and suggestions from our participants. So if you have anything to add, contribute or ask, please let us know, because it's important, and I will be taking notes that may help with the project as it goes forward. Okay, so starting with the first point of discussion. So we would like to highlight the non-interventional type of research and what is the problem. Non-interventional systematic reviews and meta-analyses, why can we not do them with the current tools? And I will ask Jade to give us some examples of her own research and why do the tools that exist at the moment don't fit it.
Yeah, so I'm going to just run through some of the barriers that I faced when I was trying to do a systematic review for my PhD. I say it in the past tense, like I finished it and it's all done dusted. I haven't. It's forever hanging over me because of all of these issues that I faced. So for context, my research in my PhD is around the topic. So I look at Parkinson's disease. Mostly what I'm doing is I'm doing sort of cross-sectional studies where I'm looking at different executive functions in people with Parkinson's compared to people without Parkinson's. So when it came to doing my systematic review, I went through sort of all the guidelines and all the tools that are out there. I settled on Prisma because that seemed to be sort of, that was the gold standard, and it was the one that kind of made the most sense to me. So I started to go through Prisma and try to figure out how I was going to approach this. And to be honest, I fell at the very first hurdle, which was developing my research question. So Prisma and quite a few other tools suggest that you write your research question following what's called the PCOS model. So it's PICOS, where the P stands for population or patients or problem, depending on what you're doing. The I stands for intervention, C, comparator, O, outcome, and S, study design. So I was doing systematic review looking at the differences between people with Parkinson's, people without Parkinson's on a range of different tasks. So when I tried to follow the PCOS model, I got stuck quite quickly. So P, population patients problem, that's quite easy. It's Parkinson's versus not Parkinson's. I for intervention, there is no intervention. You either have Parkinson's or you don't. We are not giving anybody Parkinson's. C, comparator, again, we're comparing people with Parkinson's to people without Parkinson's. So far, all I've established is that I'm interested in Parkinson's versus no Parkinson's. O for outcome, so I know what my outcome measures are. I'm interested in their performance on a variety of different tasks of executive functioning. And study design, it's going to be cross-sectional. So I kind of hadn't really got any further with my research, like defining my research question quite tightly based on this criteria. And at the time, I just thought, okay, this is the way it is. I will just plow on. But then when I came to sort of try and develop my inclusion and exclusion criteria, I started running into barriers doing the initial searches, because what I was getting out of my searches was just an unreal amount of results that I then had to sift through. And by that point, I was committed, and I just kept going forward because this is what the guidelines had told me to do, and I thought I'd followed it. So I did end up with a lot of work to do to sift through all of those studies, and the studies that are included in my review, I'm not even going to say how many studies, it's a lot of studies. It pains me to think about it. So I kind of had this feeling that there must have been some point in the process where I could have done this. I could have had a tighter research question, or I could have funneled this down earlier in the process. And it was kind of one of those situations where I thought I've gone too far to turn back. So I did not turn back, and I regret it. But I kept going, and I did all of this work, and I filtered on my studies, and I started to extract the data from all of my studies. And then the other issue was risk of bias and quality assessment. So I originally pre-registered the systematic review on Prospero, which is the site that Marta mentioned earlier. It was a very weak pre-registration. I know a lot more about pre-registration now than I did then. But in my pre-registration, I said something along the lines of, we will attempt to adapt one of the existing risk of bias and quality assessment tools for the purposes of this review, which is very wishy-washy, I know. But the reason was because I couldn't find an appropriate tool at the time. I still can't. So in the end, I tried to adapt two different tools. I tried to adapt the Newcastle-Ottawa scale, and I tried to adapt the Downs and Black scale. But by the time I'd adapted them so that they were vaguely applicable to what I wanted to do, I realized that I was introducing way more bias than I was accounting for by doing it myself and trying to make something bespoke that worked for me. And I found this really frustrating, and I always had this feeling that there must have been something that I'd missed somewhere along the line. Which is what led Marta and I to start the project in the first place. We just happened to be together in the right place at the right time, watching a talk on systematic reviews by Dorothy Bishop, and we both suddenly realised that we weren't alone in this issue, and thus Nero began. But yeah, that's kind of my experience of doing it and why we came to this point. We realised that the tool didn't exist outside of these kind of randomized control trial, healthcare settings, those kinds of studies, and there is no appropriate risk of bias and quality assessment tool either. So we aimed to make both. I think that's enough for me for the moment. Meghan?
Yeah, it's funny because like the way that you guys came to this project was kind of the same way that I did. I found Nero and this tool because I was starting to get involved with non-intervention systematic reviews and meta-analyses with actually two research teams at Princeton. And I was also like out there desperately looking for some kind of guidelines as to how to do this when there's not an intervention at the core. And so I'm a librarian, and my role in these systematic reviews is quite squarely placed in the data collection part, which is the part where you go out and you gather the studies. And in both of the cases of the two research projects that I'm working on here, there's not an intervention, but there is still some kind of a quantitative measurement that you could apply statistical analysis to, and you could still produce a meta-analysis, but there's a complete absence of intervention. So just to give you guys an idea of like what these, like a project like this might look like. So one of them is looking at any study that has a measurement of postnatal synaptic density as a function of time. So we were really combing through the literature, trying to find any study in which there was a chart that showed us this, this growth spurt in synaptic density, and then a peak, and then a pruning period and a plateau. So we were looking for this particular thing, but there's no intervention there. There's just a measurement. So the way that we ended up structuring that search and trying to find the literature that met our inclusion criteria was to look, instead of for PICO, we were looking for synaptic densities as one of our points. We were looking for age, and we were looking for time. We were looking for a particular time, and by combining those three things, we sort of made like pinch points or funnels that narrowed our literature down to the studies that were going to be the most useful. The second project is actually out of the Department of Psychology at Princeton, and this was one that was looking at attrition rates in studies at the baby lab, where they were doing near infrared spectroscopy with infants, and they were looking at studies that had any, the studies themselves had interventions or they had treatment or something in them, but that wasn't the point of the meta-analysis. The point was to look at attrition rates and to gather all of that. And for both of these, I couldn't figure out how to do it because of the lack of the intervention, and how all of the guidelines that exist so far use that PICO structure, use the intervention, use things like medical subject headings and intensive searches in PubMed, which might not always be the best fit for things that aren't non-intervention based. So in both of these cases, which are now moving into data extraction and moving on, we ended up taking guidelines from the Campbell Collective's guidelines for systematic reviews in the social and behavioral sciences and adapting them the best we could to fit this particular purpose.
So I'm here as a novice to systematic review and meta-analysis in a way. I've been involved in a project with a PhD student who is looking at the role of morphological awareness in reading comprehension, because I'm a developmental psychologist really interested in the development of language and literacy. I'm also kind of, through this interest and through the changes in priorities, involved in facilitating a group of people at Lancaster University who are all trying to learn about systematic review. And we're trying to kind of help each other along the way. And I must say the NERO guidelines that Marta and Jade have been developing with their collaborators are really a very great help. So thank you very much for that. What I wanted to mention is, another project that I'm involved in is trying to do a systematic review of fMRI studies on the role of the somatosensory cortex in speech production. And with kind of the exponential growth in the number of decisions that you have to make in analyzing data, and as many people will know in fMRI research, there's many decisions that you do have to make. Doing a systematic review seems to become exponentially more difficult to first of all get the information, what people have decided and how they came to that decision and what they've controlled for at what stage, and then trying to kind of take those things together or synthesize across these types of studies. So I've been scoping that systematic review and have been looking into ways to get around it, and came across something that's called Brain Map, which seems to have been around for quite a while, originating at the University of Texas, I think, where they have put a lot of fMRI studies on different topics into a database and trying to do this in quite a systematic way, but it only covers I think a relatively small proportion of the literature. So that has been that's pretty much the stage where I'm at, trying to get my head around how, you know, do I do the whole systematic review part with something as intrinsically variable as fMRI analysis.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you all. I will address one question that came through stating that systematic reviews are supposed to be the gold standard in terms of objectivity. Is there evidence that systematic reviews have the same biases as other types of articles? I'm hoping that from the experiences that we're explaining now, you will be able to see and judge the biases yourself. But I would just want to draw your attention to the fact that the same biases as other types of articles, those other types of articles are the articles that are in your systematic reviews. So if bias is there already, then that is already problematic for your systematic reviews. And then on top of that, you have the fact that there is general literature and publication bias, and expectations and the decisions that the reviewers or researchers of the systematic reviews need to take. So I think that we will discuss a little bit more about the problem with making decisions and deciding what to do, and making sure that we stop ourselves from making decisions that are potentially introducing bias to the systematic reviews. I hope that this answers your question, and maybe our speakers will be able to address this as well. I don't know, Jade, if you want to add something.
Do you mind if I just jump in on that as well? So any piece of research has bias in it. Systematic review also has a lot of bias in it. And I think that's why it's important to make sure you're following some guidelines that can help you reduce that bias, which, as I was saying before, is one of the issues I had, where I felt like because I wasn't able to follow the guidelines, I was just introducing more bias than I was accounting for by attempting to go my own way. However, even in that situation where you are following the guide, or say you're following the guidelines, so there was a paper by Page et al. 2019 where so they were assessing how well people adhered to the PRISMA checklist when they said they were doing it. And I've just brought it up here. So 9 out of 27 items were adhered to by fewer than 2/3 of the systematic reports that they investigated for quality. So yes, there is bias in systematic reviews, but I guess all you can do is try and address it as much as possible.
And be transparent about any issues that you have with regards to sticking to the guidelines and the guidance given. So this brings us very nicely to our next discussion point, which is how can new tools address the issues with systematic reviews and meta-analyses. I already mentioned a few things that we are trying to do in addressing with the project, which include the pre-registration, transparency statements, and producing lots of documents that sort of record the decision processes and making them open and available as well. But I'm not going to go on for too long on this. I think that we can give voice to Meghan and Margriet to let us know what they think about this, since they are doing their neuro systematic reviews meta-analyses. So Meghan, if you would like to share your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think the two things that I had for suggestions as to how to make this a better process for people who are really in it is to, first of all, to reframe the search strategy part of this whole process as data collection. Because what I see from my perspective as someone who's working primarily on the data collection part of this is that most researchers approach, they know that they have to go out and search the literature to find studies that meet their inclusion criteria, and I think they assume like, okay, I need to find literature. It's going to be like doing a literature review, and I can just kind of put together some search strings, and I can, you know, just go to my favorite databases and do it. And right there, you've already introduced bias because it's not meeting the standard of having a comprehensive or nearly exhaustive search. So the way that we kind of reduce that literature bias is by trying to get 100% coverage, as close to 100% coverage that we can get of all of those studies that exist, that meet your inclusion criteria. And you're not going to be able to do that if you do it in kind of a haphazard way. It really does have to be rigorous. It has to be very well structured. It has to be very well thought out. And there are ways to do this. And I think providing really good guidelines for that and framing it as what you're doing here is data collection. It needs to be just as rigorous as data collection for any other study. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be reproducible. It needs to be very well documented. There are ways to validate your search to make sure that you're getting everything that's potentially out there and the places that you're looking. You need to ask yourself a lot of questions about the limits that you're putting on your search and provide justification for those. And so I'm hoping that the new tool will be something that will walk researchers through those decision-making points and the questions that they should be asking themselves when they want to do a systematic review, and hopefully provide some context and some ways to think about these questions, like why might it not be a good idea to limit only to full text? Or is it okay if we want to just limit to studies that are done in English? Or is it okay, is there ever okay to have a publication date limiter put on your search? How does this increase or decrease our chance of having some kind of a literature bias?
Yes, I would definitely second that. And I would also say, I think one of the things that I found, consult a librarian who knows about who knows about systematic review. We recently invited somebody to our group at Lancaster, and it was just a revelation in how he went about building a search, because it is really very, very different from doing a quick literature search on PubMed or you know, on the Web of Science or wherever. Let alone Google Scholar. Yeah, so I would definitely say that would be really important. The other thing I wanted to talk about is what I found is when in being involved in a systematic review and trying to extract data from different papers, and code different papers, it becomes very obvious what is missing. So people often don't report the information that you need in their papers. And I mean, for various techniques, there are reporting guidelines out there, but it turns out people don't necessarily adhere to these guidelines very precisely. So that then gets you in a lot of trouble. So you might have to write to the authors or something like that to try to get as much of that information as possible, but it makes the process quite complicated and long-winded. So I think improving reporting of things that are relevant for systematic reviews and meta-analyses is hopefully something that can be done using the tool. And something else that becomes very evident when you're involved in something like that is that people might refer to one thing as to use the same word for something that means completely different things, or is calculated in a completely different way across different papers. So I've been involved in some work on laterality, so the two halves of the brain being involved in processes to different extents. And the way a laterality index, kind of a main measure of whether the left brain, whether areas on the left are more active or areas on the right are more active in a certain task, the laterality index can be calculated in a lot of different ways, which makes it really hard to compare studies even when they use the same methodology, let alone when you're comparing studies across methodologies. So maybe fMRI work and transcranial Doppler work. As people interested in particular language lateralization, we're currently involved in a process that's called Delphi or Delphi, where kind of a really broad range of well, what you call experts goes through several rounds of articulating what they feel is essential in calculating and reporting, in this case, a laterality index. And all those statements are kind of made anonymously, and then it's moderated. So there's some people who kind of summarize all those different statements, and then you go to a next round where everybody again comments on this collection of statements in an anonymous way, and you try to kind of end up with the Delphi method is a structured way to end up with a set of guidelines of how this particular thing should be done, possibly across different methodologies. So something like that is, I think, really valuable in trying to facilitate future systematic reviews and meta-analyses.
Fantastic. Those are really important points. And I would just like to maybe draw attention to something really important that Margriet said about reporting guidelines. So I think one thing that we are also trying to emphasize is the fact that there is quality and rigor and care that needs to be taken in the design of the protocol for the systematic review, which is what comes as the pre-registration part, and making sure that we prevent bias at this stage before collecting the data, following Meghan's suggestion for terminology. And then after we have the data, how to rigorously and transparently report what we found. And this relates to both systematic reviews just by themselves with qualitative synthesis and with meta-analyses, which brings me to my last point of discussion that we have scheduled here, is the fact that neuroscience is a very quantitative field, and it might be quite odd to think about doing a systematic review without a meta-analysis where all of the analysis in our field is quantitative. But actually, there are quite a few reasons why sometimes it's not possible to push a certain systematic review towards a meta-analysis. And I would like to give a few examples regarding the fact that there might be just a few studies available on the topic that you're investigating. There might be very high heterogeneity between the study with regards to the methods and the variables that are being studied. Like Margriet also suggested the fact that there isn't really a consensus on how those things are done in general, and therefore you can't really compare the results across the studies. And also there might be variable or in general rather low quality of the studies that you've included in your systematic reviews, and you feel like you might not be able to trust the results in the way that you would want to with quantitative data. So I would like us speakers to comment on or give us some suggestions regarding doing systematic reviews in neuro research without the component of a meta-analysis, and how can we emphasize the fact that it's important to do that? What are the reasons? How would we encourage someone to do a systematic review if they cannot do quantitative analysis on their data?
I can think of a number of reasons why you would want to employ these kind of methods, even if it didn't lead to a meta-analysis. And the two reasons that I kind of see for going through, again, I'm coming from the lens of like data collection and going out and gathering every study that meets a certain criteria that you have. There's a number of reasons why you might want to do that. And the two that I see the most are, one, to get every single possible data point I really have that 100% complete data set to either definitively answer a question, to make a model, to to do a meta-analysis or to do a narrative or to find a gap. There's lots of reasons. The other reason would be to reduce bias, increase transparency, and reproducibility of whatever that, how you're actually doing that really comprehensive, if not exhaustive, searching. And I don't think the output necessarily has to be a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis, they are incredibly time consuming. They're costly. You need a team. You need not just a team, like you need a team who's like really dedicated because they take such a long time and they're very intense. And that doesn't necessarily always need to be the output. It could be something like a narrative review. You could even do something like history of science. You could look at trends over time. You could collect this data and do, interesting data stuff with it. I could think of lots of different reasons, but I think at the core of it is those 2 points. One, to get as close to 100% coverage of the studies that meet your inclusion criteria, and 2, to do it in a way that's reproducible and transparent and limits as much bias as possible.
Can I add on to that as well? So I think the biggest reason for people to do a systematic review is that if you're about to embark on a new study, you want to make sure that what you're doing is theoretically sound, hasn't been done before. And it just seems to make sense to do a systematic review first, because every piece of research contains a literature review in the form of an introduction. It's a type of literature review. But why you wouldn't want to know everything there is to know strikes me as odd. I think the thing that puts people off is it is such a massive undertaking. And my experience of doing my systematic review for my PhD is it was a very solo endeavor. And that can be really difficult to do. Like, obviously I had the support of my supervisors, but their time is limited as well. They didn't have the time to dedicate. So I think, I don't know. I feel like a systematic review is the only way to start a project. I'm becoming more and more convinced of this because, when you get partway through a project and you suddenly find that one paper that you wish you'd found before, systematic review would avoid that issue happening, I think.
Lovely. Okay. So I don't know, Margriet, if you want to add anything to this or...
Not really. I really agree with what the others have said. It's I think I guess my hope is that it might become more of a team effort, because I think you're right. It can be a very solo activity, which is not very particularly pleasant given the scale of things. So if people can team up, then that's much more fun.
And reach out to your librarian.
yes, no, I really do think that's very important.
Yeah, I don't think that many researchers understand that, like, that's something that you don't have to tackle by yourself. Advising on things like what databases to choose in your keyword structure and how to form syntax and how to tailor a search to every database or source that you're looking for. These are things that are totally included in my job. Like, I am paid to help you do those things. But there are some of us out there who you can invite us to be a co-author on your paper, and we will do that data collection for you. We will work with you to come up with a search strategy that makes sense. We'll get a handful of articles. We'll use it to validate the search. We'll run the searches, document them, deduplicate the results, and we will hand you a deduplicated set of studies that you can then, your team can focus on the screening and the data extraction and everything else. And then usually what I do is I also contribute draft language to the methodology section, and I provide that documentation for the search so that it's reproducible and you can put that in your publication.
Brilliant.
You can reach out to me. Like, if you don't have a neuroscience librarian, like, reach out to me, and like, either I can try to help you or I can try to find somebody who can.
I think one of the things that we can take away from this session, if you've not managed to follow it all very closely, then take-home message is, if you are going to do a systematic review, make sure to contact your librarian, because they are tremendous help, and they know what they're doing, and it will help with making your research more systematic and reproducible. And hopefully all librarians will know about our tool Nero as well soon, so it will be promoted across as well. Cool. So now we have about 10 minutes left. If any of our speakers would like to add any final notes, in the meantime, you can add your comments and any questions that you have, or any other discussion points, short discussion points, considering we don't have much time left. I can see that we have had a comment about bids, and I'm seeing some more comments coming through as well. So I'll have a read through that, and maybe our speakers have any other concluding statements. We're just reading through the comments.
Sorry, I'm catching up on the comments and the questions.
No, me too.
I think if I had a closing comment, it would be something like, you know, don't be afraid of trying to do this, even if you are an early career researcher. Like, it is something that is doable. And especially now when a lot of our labs are closed or doing phase reopenings where you can't get in and, you know, run participants, like, this is a great way to like super familiarize yourself with the literature in your field. And if you can get, you know, a team of maybe say 3 people, you know, plus maybe a librarian on board to help you do this, it's entirely possible. So to give you an idea of a time frame for the two projects that I'm involved in right now that I mentioned, the one for the synaptic density, that was a really big project. It has a team of, I think, maybe 5 or 6 people who are scanning through the results. The results were something like 11,000. That was the first data set that we needed to go through. But the one for the attrition rates for the FNIR study, that one was so tidy. I think it was just 2 or 3 individuals did that. I think the total first initial data set was like, it was below 2,000, and when it cuts about in half when you deduplicate, they really had a very small data set. They were able to do it, and you know, they were able to move really quite quickly through that in about a week and get to the point where they were actually extracting data and running analyses. I think for the bigger project, the data collection phase took about 2-3 weeks to really hammer out. It's the screening process, I think, that takes a really, really long time and takes the time commitment, but it is doable.
Jade, would you? Yep, there you go.
I kind of feel like some of the people watching this have made some really nice closing comments for us, really, based on what we've been saying. Can I just read one of them out? So Amy says that a systematic review is a massive undertaking, but it's also a beautiful way to look at the literature from a macroscopic rather than a typical microscopic view of the topic. This can lead to meta-analysis, quantitative, that can tease out the nuances of a topic that may often be missed. So I really like that comment. I'm just going to leave it at that. But I can also answer one of the questions as well, if that's okay. So someone asked, is it possible to do a systematic review by yourself? Because often they include 2 or more reviewers, co-authors. I would say it's possible, but inadvisable for many reasons. First one is just you really don't want the headache of trying to do one by yourself. The second issue is that if you do one by yourself, you've got no sort of internal quality control on what you're doing. So one of the things that we recommend in Nero, and many other tools recommend as well, is that every stage of the process you have at least 2 people going through every step. So you have 2 people screening all of your search results to see whether you want to take that to the next screening stage. So when you so if you're at the beginning, you'll have all of your search results, and you'll be checking titles and abstracts usually just to see if it looks relevant based on your criteria. You want 2 people doing that ideally, if not more, so that, and do it independently as well, so you can't see what the other person said, and that way you can check the agreement between the 2 of you, and then you kind of and then you can resolve any discrepancies between your answers. So at least 2, if not more, people is ideal for that. And then the same applies to when you're reading the full text of the paper and deciding whether to include it. You want at least 2 people doing that. And the same for all stages of data extraction, quality assessment, etc. I would say a minimum of 2 people. So when I did mine, it was me and my 2 supervisors, and we also had some other students kind of chip in as well to try and make sure that process was as rigorous as possible. If you're doing it by yourself, you've just got no sense of whether what you've done is, I don't want to say correct, because there's always some element of subjectivity, but I think you need that perspective from other people, and multiple people is ideal. So you can, but I probably wouldn't.
I would agree with that. Like, for most of the time for systematic reviews that are based in like biomedical literature, it's a minimum of 3. So you have 2 people looking at it, and then you have a tiebreaker, which is also why we say that it's okay to kind of limit the languages, because you need the languages that all 3 of those people can completely understand and process. But again, the end result doesn't have to be a meta-analysis. You can apply these same, rigorous methods and come up with a really lovely narrative review, or come up with a really detailed literature review. There's lots of other outputs for that. It doesn't have to be this strenuous.
Maybe I can add just a few words to that. Then that it sounds really kind of time consuming, and for everybody, if you do this with 3 people and you partly kind of you double code, you're doing the same ones and things like that, but it can be incredibly informative. Having done a screening phase recently myself, we went through several batches of papers, and then we would make different decisions on them, and we would discuss that, and you think like, oh, and it refines what you're looking for, and it refines what you really mean by your inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria, what falls in under certain concepts. So it is a very informative exercise, and then you kind of go through to the whole batch. But yeah, and and I mean, if you're interested in the topic, it can be very interesting, a discussion of that kind.
Fantastic. Just wanted to go. Well, I'm not going to read the comment from Sam, but thank you, Sam, for your lovely comment, appreciating the sort of descriptive rather than quantitative overview of the literature. But I am going to also respond to the suggestion that there should be a BIDS app to synthesize the data. And I think that this is a great idea, and perhaps something that could be brought forward to the next NeuroHack, because it would be brilliant to have it. So that's that. We have had some responses regarding the fact that some of your labs are working on synthesizing data, and you've created some resources as well. So if we could continue this discussion on the Mattermost channel, that would be great, because we love to bring together all the resources that are available and share them, and see how we can maybe collaborate to develop more as well. We are always looking for collaborators for the Neuro project. It's an open collaboration, and we have lots of different branches of the project as well. So we are looking to develop a more specific part for meta-analyses. We are, the next step is also to develop a risk of bias assessment tool. So there's lots to get yourself involved with, and we're always open for that. So yeah, I don't know, Jade, if you want to add.
Yeah, so what Marta was saying about collaborators, one of the things that's really great about this project is that our collaborators are made up of people of all career levels. So master's students, I don't know if we have any undergrads, but we definitely have master's students and upwards. We have people from all over the world, which is brilliant. Not so good when you're trying to organize meetings, but we deal with it. So we've got so many different time zones. And also just people of different levels of expertise. So I wouldn't say that Marta and I are systematic review experts. We've kind of found ourselves in this position. But it's all supported by a range of people who are complete novices on one end, and who kind of really helpful for figuring out the information that we need to be giving. And then you've got the super experts at the other end who are helping us whenever we get stuck and confused. So I don't think there's anyone who's not in a position to help if you have any interest at all in systematic reviews. If you've never done one, we still like to have you on board.
Okay, right. On that note, I would like to thank our speakers for joining us today. It's time for us to go.